In this video, we're going to talk about the ways in which cells can interact with their environment. Now, if you remember from previous videos, we've talked a lot about cells and how they are all enveloped in what is known as a cell membrane. The cell membrane, which can sometimes be referred to as the plasma membrane, is a layer of phospholipids that separates the inside from the outside of the cell. Now, the cell membrane itself is a phospholipid bilayer. So you can remember we have those phospholipids, right, that are in fact lipids, and lipids are insoluble in water. So the cell membrane does not dissolve when exposed to water. And this membrane is selectively permeable. And what that means is that if we have our phospholipid bilayers, we've got two layers here, that it can choose, not necessarily consciously, but because of its chemical nature, some molecules can pass through. Maybe they're small, really tiny, can easily slip through the phospholipids, or maybe there is no conflict in chemistry, so the molecule can pass through. However, some molecules are either too large to pass through, or they cannot pass through because of their chemical properties. Maybe they're charged or they're polar or non-polar, right? So it's selectively permeable. Some things can enter and some things cannot, and that helps maintain homeostasis. And if you remember from earlier videos, homeostasis is all about a nice and happy balance, right? In other words, the cell wants to be able to control what it needs to function properly, whether it's temperature or pH, and in the case of cell transport, the concentration of molecules and compounds and ions inside of the cell as they might compare to the outside of the cell. Okay, now let's take a look at the structure of the cell membrane. So here we can see the phospholipid bilayer. So I can see one layer of phospholipids here and a second layer down here. So let's talk a little bit about the phospholipids, since it's, the primary component of our cell plasma membrane. So here's our little phospholipid. Here's our little phosphate head and our fatty acid tails, right? And so we can think about the phosphate head as being hydrophilic. In other words, it is attracted to water. And so we would consider this part of the phospholipid to be polar. Now, fatty acid tails are nonpolar or hydrophobic. So they are afraid of water. So when you put phospholipids together and they form this phospholipid bilayer, the fatty acid tails are hiding from water. So they're hiding on the inside, and that creates a nonpolar region of the cell. So that makes it difficult for polar molecules or charged molecules to pass through the membrane, right? Again, aiding in its selective permeability. Now, there are some other pieces of our cell membrane puzzle, one of which right here is cholesterol, which is another lipid. It belongs to the steroid group. And cholesterol helps keep the phospholipid bilayer malleable or fluid, right? And so it can move and things can shift around because of the cholesterol, and that prevents it from getting like really rigid and stiff. And then we can see that we have various proteins either stuck to the inside or the outside of the cell membrane, or we also have some transmembrane protein. Trans meaning across, membrane referring to the plasma membrane. And these integral or transmembrane proteins are what allow larger molecules to enter and exit the cell that might not be able to readily permeate straight through the phospholipids. And then we've got some other peripheral proteins that might aid in cell signaling or various chemical reactions. They might be enzymes. And then we have some proteins on the outside that might have certain compounds that help cells communicate with one another, or they could be receptors, and they are specific to receiving certain molecules from outside. Okay, now cells can let things in and out through two types of transport, right? Passive transport is the movement of molecules across the membrane where no energy is required. And molecules tend to, in nature, want to go from high concentration to low concentration. They just want to spread out. Imagine if you had a glass container with cologne or perfume in it, right? The scent molecules are highly concentrated in that container. If you were to drop that glass bottle of cologne or perfume and it were to shatter on the ground, those perfume molecules, those molecules that give the cologne and the perfume the scent, would go from high concentration and they would slowly spread out throughout the room, right? And that's just what molecules naturally want to do. And so passive transport involves the natural tendency or desire for molecules to go from high concentration to low concentration. And so if we look up here at this diagram, you can see we've got a high concentration of some molecule up here. And in this case, it can permeate through the membrane. And it's going to continue to do this, right, with no energy required. And these molecules will continue to passively move across this membrane until they're equal, right, until they're all spread out. Down here, we have a larger molecule that's highly concentrated outside of the cell, and it wants to go in, right? It wants to go from high concentration to low concentration. And in this case, this particular molecule needs some help. And so it's going to pass through one of these integral transmembrane proteins. And a lot of times we call these transport proteins. And then we've got active transport, which the name implies is a more active process. And if you're going to actively do something or you're an active person, you've got a lot of energy or you're going to need a lot of energy. And so active transport tends to move molecules against their natural tendency, right? So again, molecules want to go from high to low concentration. They want to spread out. But sometimes our cells want to move things and keep them concentrated either inside of the cell or outside of the cell. And to do this, it needs to go against the grain, if you will, and that requires energy in the form of ATP. So hey, now we're finally seeing why we need to make all that ATP during cellular respiration. Now, to help you remember the difference, right? Just remember passive, right? There's no energy. You don't need energy. Active, you need energy. But I like to think of riding a wagon down the hill, right? And so if I'm sitting on a wagon at the top of a hill, right, I'm at a high altitude or I am high up on the hill and I want to go to a lower altitude, right, or a lower elevation, right? And so it's not going to take any energy for this wagon to passively roll down that hill, right, with the gradient, right? Riding downhill, that's passive. Whereas if maybe you've already gone down the hill, right? Or you've been sledding and your wagon is now at a low point, right? Or a lower elevation. You want to get back to your high point so you can snowboard down the hill again or, ride your wagon down the hill or your mountain bike. That's going to be an active process, right? That's my least favorite part of sledding is dragging the sled back up the hill because it's going to be active, right? So you're going against the grain. You're going against the grade. So it's like driving down the highway, right? So coming down out of the mountains, it's a very passive process for your engine, whereas driving up the mountain is very active and it's going to require a lot of fuel. And so when we go from low to high in our cells, energy is needed, and energy in the cell is going to be provided by ATP produced by respiration. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the natural tendency of molecules, right? And so a lot of times when we're studying molecules and their environment, we talk about concentration, right? So how many red dots do we have in this container, right? And so right now, these red dots are highly concentrated. Maybe I just dripped a single drop of food dye into a beaker of water. Now, we've all watched dye slowly spread out through a solution, or maybe this is a tea bag, right? So maybe you're making sweet tea and you've placed the tea bag into your mug of hot water, and we've all watched the water go from clear and it slowly spreads and it becomes a nice even color. So molecules naturally want to do this. They want to go from high concentration to low concentration until they reach equilibrium, until each of these molecules is an equal distance apart, right? I mean, think about it being on a crowded airplane. If you've been on a crowded airplane on a transatlantic flight, you're all so crowded together that as soon as that plane lands and as soon as that door opens, people tend to rush out of the plane and they want to just get away from each other. And molecules are kind of the same way, especially if they, share a similar charge, right? So what if these were all positively charged compounds? They're all going to want to, get away from each other and spread out. And that would be passive, no energy required. Now, we do need to discuss some vocabulary, okay? Let me make my face a little smaller so I'm not so in the way, okay? Now, let's say we're going to make some brine solution or a saltwater solution, right? And so we're going to take some salt and we're going to sprinkle it into a container of water. Now, we all know that salt dissolves in water, and if we stir our mixture, if we wait long enough, or if we heat it up, we know that the salt will dissolve, and what we'll end up with is salt water. Well, let's talk about some vocabulary here. The salt is going to be what is dissolved, and so we call that the solute. And in this case, water is going to do the dissolving, and so we would refer to that as the solvent. And so we add our solute to our solvent, and we end up with a solution. Now, if we were going to make sweet tea, I want you to ask yourself, what would the solute or solutes be? And what would the solvent be? Well, if we're making sweet tea, sugar would be one of the solutes because we were going to add the sugar to our water, and the water will dissolve the sugar. And so the water, in this case, would be our solvent. And then we're probably also going to add tea or tea leaves, right? And so the compounds, the tannins and other compounds in the tea leaves will slowly dissolve into water. And so the tannins or the compounds in the tea leaves, those would be our solutes. And then the water, again, would be our solvent. And our final solution would be sweet tea, containing dissolved sugar as well as the compounds in the tea leaves. Now, water in biology is considered the universal solvent. All right, and that's why when we talk about the cytoplasm or the solution inside of a cell, you can assume that the solvent is water. And a lot of times cells, like the cells in our body, they're either freely floating around in a solution or they're in a tissue with solution surrounding them, and that solution is generally going to be aqueous, which means water is the solvent or primary component or ingredient. Now, there are three types of passive transport that we are going to talk about. The first one is diffusion. Now, diffusion is the movement of particles. These particles could be molecules, compounds, or ions, and they're going from high to low. So they would diffuse through the membrane, right? And so you can kind of think about our tea bag example, right? So you've got our tea bag with our shredded leaves inside of the bag. Well, the tea is highly concentrated in that tea bag. When we place that bag into a beaker or a container of water, the flavors and the tannins, they diffuse out. They diffuse out of the tea bag into the water, which is our solvent, and they would spread out until they reach equilibrium, moving from high to low concentration. So you can see that over here, right? So here we got a lot of molecules. They're highly concentrated, and they want to spread out. And so they could simply diffuse through the membrane, and we call that simple diffusion. They don't need any help. They can easily diffuse through the membrane and spread out. And there's no energy required, so it's passive. Now, sometimes molecules are big, right? Or maybe they have a charge, and they still want to move from high to low. Well, they need some help. And that help is provided by a transport protein, and that is facilitated diffusion. That word facilitate, right? So when I facilitate an exam, I'm not taking the exam for you. I'm just making sure that you're in an environment where you can complete your exam. So a facilitated diffusion is where a protein helps molecules go from high to low. Maybe they're too big or maybe they're charged. So right down here, you've got these little positively charged ions, and maybe you've got a ton of them on the outside of the cell. And they want to go from high to low, but since they're charged, they can't get through the phospholipid bilayer. And so they have to pass through one of these transport proteins, one of these transmembrane proteins, and that'd be facilitated diffusion. Large molecules like glucose are simply too big to simply diffuse to the membrane, so they need some help. And in this case, the help is provided by a specific transport protein. And if I can remember correctly, I think it's the GLUT protein, like big G, little L, little U, and then a big T for a glucose transporting protein. And this particular protein actually changes its shape, right? So glucose binds to the outside and it creates a little chemical reaction and it transports glucose across the membrane. But again, it's still passive, okay? So no energy required. And we're still going from high concentration to low concentration. And the last one is osmosis, right? And osmosis is the movement of water. Water also wants to go from high concentration to low concentration. And water can diffuse through the membrane, and it can also be facilitated, right? So it can also travel through transport proteins, and some cells have what is known as an aquaporin, which is a transport protein that helps water move into and out of the cell, because some cells need water to move very rapidly. So they do need some extra help, right? But again, it's passive. Water's going to go where water wants to go, from high concentration to low concentration. Now, here's an example. Right? So in our lungs, right, we've got, our lungs are not just these big sacs that fill with air, right? They're actually filled with tiny, tiny, tiny little branched networks of tubes. And these bronchioles, which are a part of those branches, end up at these little air sacs, right, known as alveoli, or if you're looking at just one of them, right, in this case, the alveolus, right, air can travel into these tiny little air sacs. And these little air sacs are lined with tiny thin layers of cells. And surrounding each of these air sacs are what are known as capillaries, really, 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 really thin tubes with which our body can transport blood. And since these capillaries and the alveolus are really, really thin, and these cells are really, really thin, these gas molecules are really tiny. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are really small, and they can passively diffuse into and out of these cells. Well, when you take a big breath of air in, right, you're going to have lots of oxygen inside of your lungs. It's going to be highly concentrated. And that oxygen is going to passively diffuse into your bloodstream, and it'll bind to hemoglobin, and your heart will help transport that oxygen where it's needed. Now, once the oxygen is used up, right, and so maybe the oxygenated blood cells delivered oxygen to your muscle cells for aerobic respiration, and then the red blood cells no longer have oxygen, well, they're going to be sent back to the lungs, and they're going to be carrying carbon dioxide, right? Because remember, carbon dioxide is a product of aerobic respiration, and so we need to get rid of it. And so the red blood cells will deliver the carbon dioxide back to the lungs. And since there's more carbon dioxide inside of your blood than we would find in the air, it simply diffuses out of your blood and into your lungs, so that when you exhale, carbon dioxide is released. And this is a really important concept to realize, that, oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse in and out of our lungs directly into our bloodstream when considering CPR, right? And so when you perform CPR on an individual, there are two main components: the compressions and the breaths. Well, if you had to choose between the two, the compression or the breaths, which of those do you feel like is maybe more important? It's the compressions, right? So if you're having to give someone CPR, and if you have to talk to 911 on the phone, it's fine if you have to skip the breaths, because the compressions are probably the most important part. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, right? So obviously taking a CPR class and whatever the doctor or the trainers tell you is obviously going to supersede whatever it is I say. But the compressions are really important, because as long as the individual's mouth is open and you're compressing the heart and the lungs, you're kind of creating a vacuum. You push down the heart, it pushes blood throughout the body, hopefully delivering whatever oxygen might still be left. And then carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood from these muscles that are trying to stay alive. And then when you release the pressure, all of that blood moves back to the heart, or air back into the lungs, and that allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse in and out, right? And so that's kind of the basic premise of CPR, right? Now, when you add the breaths, obviously you're forcefully adding additional volumes of air into their lungs. But the compressions are what going to keep this little flow of blood moving past the alveolus, allowing carbon dioxide out and oxygen in.